Hello, everyone. We're really happy to be able to present to you folks today. And we are the Global Policy Project team that worked with the Dallaire Center for Excellence in Peace and Security. It will be referred to afterward as DCOE. So if you hear that acronym, you know what it is. And so our presentation is titled The Collaboration to Implement the Vancouver Principles on the Prevention of Recruitment of Child Soldiers. And so we'll be going over some challenges and recommendations. Can someone change the slide, please? Oh, wonderful, thank you. And so for an agenda for today's presentation is we'll be talking about some context and grounding, which we will go over what the Vancouver Principles are. We'll be talking about our methodology there as well. Then we're going to go into a quick thematic analysis where we'll be discussing our 4 core themes. And so the 2 that are listed on the screen in front of you are theme 1, which is the coordination and collaboration within UN missions. And then afterward, we'll be discussing awareness of the Vancouver Principles. We'll be providing more context and also some recommendations for that as well. Naturally, due to the fulsome, amount of our work, we'll only be talking about these 2 for this 15-minute session. And first and foremost, we would like to acknowledge the lands on which we are gathered here today. And for folks on Zoom, you may be virtually gathered on. And so we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples here at the UBC Vancouver campus. However, we want to also be very explicit when we say as well that our global policy project and a fair amount of our class over the past 8 months, I would say, was actually virtual, and so it was not conducted exclusively within these territories as well. I also want to be able to give a content warning for folks too. There are going to be mentions of sexualized violence, gender-based violence, and also violence against children as well. If these are things that may upset you, or you may just want to step outside or turn off your cameras, please feel free to do so. It's all good. And so with that in mind, I will pass to my colleague Moysal to talk about the Vancouver Principles.
Thank you so much, Will. Hi, everyone. And Moysal, I'm going to take you through a broad overview of what the Vancouver Principles are and then what our global policy project was with the Dallaire Center for advancing these principles. So first things first, what are the Vancouver Principles? So the Vancouver Principles are essentially a set of political commitments. So they're comprised of 17 principles geared towards preventing the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict, specifically within UN peacekeeping missions. So these principles were actually launched right here in Vancouver, BC, not too long ago, November 17 at the UN Peacekeeping Defense Ministerial Conference that was held here. And they've gone on to be endorsed by over 100 countries. And while the launch and the endorsement of the Vancouver Principles is essential, and it is one part of the equation. The other part of the equation really lies in the implementation and operationalizing these principles on the ground to see applicable change. And that's where our global policy project comes in with the Dallaire Center. So our project and our team, we set off to find what to identify and find what the challenges were to operationalizing and implementing these principles on the ground. And we did that specifically through the lens of the military component within UN peacekeeping missions. And to take you through how all that data was collected is Will.
Thank you, Moysal. And so with that in mind, we utilized the snowball method in order to conduct 15 semi-structured interviews and focus group discussions. And afterward, we were able to compile all of that qualitative data into software. So that way we were able to look at trends both within stakeholder groups and outside of them as well. This is especially important because for our 5 main stakeholder groups, they varied quite deeply in the words they use, the terminology, and even their knowledge of these topics as well. And then finally, we utilized a thematic analysis for this research study along with a literature review in order to ground our analysis within current academic knowledge. And so as you folks can see both on Zoom and in person, our largest stakeholder group were actually civil society professionals. They made up close to 1/3 of our sample size. And then it was followed quickly by academics and then subject matter experts and then folks within the UN system. And of course, we cannot forget military personnel as well. And so with that in mind, I'll be passing it to my colleague to discuss the 4 key themes for today.
Little tag team action there. Yeah. All right, guys, so I'm going to take you through our 4 core themes. So these are the broad emerging themes that were derived from our research and analysis. And although there's 4 themes for today's presentation, we're going to take the quality time to go through the first 2. So KJ and Wilson will take you through a deep dive of coordination and collaboration, as well as awareness of VPs. And that's just because they were our strongest emerging themes in our research. So just a broad overview for coordination and collaboration. Our first theme is about this concept between military and civilian components of UN peacekeeping missions. And essentially this theme unpacks what challenges UN troops face among other stakeholders, either within the UN mission or the wider CSO ecosystem. For the second theme, awareness of VPs, this theme discusses the challenges of dissemination of the VPs to other stakeholders on the ground or around these missions, as well as within the wider intellectual or academic space. Third is training and knowledge. This theme unravels the challenges in pre-deployment training for UN troops in areas of child protection, as well as unpacking the lack of overlapping knowledge between the human rights space as well as the military space. And lastly, we have ineffective action. So this theme recognizes the unique and contributing role that UN troops play on the ground, but it also unpacks the challenges they face in optimizing their role to its fullest potential. And to go into a deep dive of our first theme is going to be KJ.
Thank you so much, Moysal. I've been told I'm loud, so I'll keep this a little far away from me. So I'm going to be speaking about the 2 sub-themes of collaboration and coordination. The first is the perception of UN troops or the military component. And the second is the relationship between this military component and the non-military or civilian component in UN missions. So coming to our first sub-theme, one of the most striking observations we had was that all of our respondents from the civil society ecosystem chose to mention and discuss atrocities that have been committed by UN troops in the past. Most of these comments were focused on sexual crimes and cases of corruption. But this was interesting to us because we never asked them a question about this. There was no prompt to discuss this, but it was clear that this was a lingering perception in their minds. They often spoke about these things even after we had asked them to actually come back to the topic, and it was clear that it was front and center in their minds. And even though in the last 2 decades, the number of these atrocities and these incidents have really decreased, these civil society actors didn't really know much about effective training or any change in the culture that had taken place with the military troops. So this perception barrier, it immediately creates problems in both trust building and also in the formation of meaningful relationships to work together on ground. So this has continued to linger in the minds of these people all the time, right? And this hinders the acceptance and exploration that, yes, in the first place, military components can actually play a larger role in the prevention of recruitment of children in armed conflict. Now, stemming from this trust deficit point, if we can have the next slide, we found that one of the emerging factors that came in the relationship between these 2 components was the period of deployment. While UN troops or military components are deployed for a period of 6 months to 1 year, in the case of the Canadian Armed Forces, that's 6 months, civil society professionals can be deployed for 2 years or more. Now, we have to understand that coordination between these 2 teams is not a vague, ambiguous concept. It's about the creation of human relationships on ground and how those relationships can actually work together to create effective change, right? But this sort of difference in the period of deployment really disincentivizes the creation of this relationship on ground. As one of our respondents put it really nicely, by the time we can start creating relationships with these people, their deployment period is over and new people get deployed. We want to make relationships with them, but why should we if they're going to leave in 6 months, right? So that was one of the things. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, there are also what we found many cultural and political dynamics and differences when it comes to these 2 teams. For example, many of the troops from many troop contributing countries have never worked with women before. but a majority of the staff in the civil society component of these UN missions are women, right? So what can we actually do about these things? What are our recommendations when we talk about this? Our first recommendation is a joint protection team. This comes from a best practice in the MONUSCO mission in Congo. These small teams can be created by integrating civilian, police, and military staff with diverse expertise. These teams can respond much faster and can integrate their knowledge bases to create strategic plans for action, right? And this comes, as I mentioned, from our respondents who have worked in Congo. The second recommendation we have is the use of the swift trust theory. How do we actually create trust? How do we build trust between teams in a short period of time in complex situations? A lot more on this can be found in our report, but a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is integrated trainings and workshops. How do we get these people together in the same room to be trained on integrated topics? And the second is, how do we focus on how these teams are structured in the first place? Can troops or the military components that are newly deployed actually provide supportive roles to civil society actors in the beginning, right? Because a lot of civil society actors came back to us and said, okay, we don't like to work with military people many of the time. Their personality is very lofty and they think they're much better than us at many things. So, and that's where they told us, and that's where our third recommendation comes in, that no one asked us what the military should be doing to help us, right? No one has asked us in the past. And what we want them to do is actually pay more attention on remote areas, areas where civil society actors don't have access to, right? And what can they do there? They say that the troops need to be monitoring communities, monitoring schools, monitoring dangerous areas where re-recruitment is possible. They need help in actually sustaining the reintegration of children so that they can make sure that no child is ever recruited again. And now I'm going to pass it off to Wilson to discuss our second big theme.
Thank you very much, KJ. So I'm going to be presenting our second theme, awareness of the Vancouver Principles. So one of the emerging themes from our research, from our analysis, was the lack of awareness of the Vancouver Principles amongst stakeholders who collaborate to prevent the recruitment of children in armed conflicts. So for instance, when we were conducting our interview with our study participants, we asked the question like, are you aware of the Vancouver Principles? Have you used them in your daily work? And to our surprise, not many of them knew much about the Vancouver Principles and have used them in their work. So, and one of our study participants from the CSO told us that he sat in 10 meetings a day with the UN troops and CSOs, and not once the Vancouver Principles were ever mentioned. And then, as my colleague Moysal mentioned earlier, the Vancouver Principles were endorsed in 2017, and the implementation plan was drawn out in 2019. But the implementation plan has not yet been transformed into an actionable strategy that stakeholders on ground working in these complex emergencies can use to prevent the recruitment of children in armed conflicts. So based on these findings from our analysis, we are recommending two things to DCOE. One is to partnership with universities through research, and the other is to advocate for the VP. So partnership with university through research, as we all know, universities are incubators of knowledge and well suited for facilitating theoretical and empirical research that could serve as a point to create awareness strategy for the VP. So what my colleagues and I are doing here today is a clear example by which the Vancouver Principles can be disseminated in an academic ecosystem. And also the partnership between DCOE and UBC has made it possible for all of you who are listening today know that this framework exists and can be used to prevent the recruitment of children in armed conflicts. So our second recommendation, advocacy for the VP. So what we're doing here, we are just calling on policymakers, academics, civil society professionals, and even child rights advocates to take the VP to their online discourses through Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and even TikTok, to raise consciousness of the VP among their networks. So I'll just stop here and then turn it over to KJ, who will close up.
Thank you, Wilson, and thank you so much, everyone. And just to end, we wanted to bring your attention to Feb 12th. Feb 12th is Red Hand Day, where the whole world gets together to actually spread awareness about child soldiers and children in armed conflict. And there are multiple ways where you can get involved. There's a QR code on screen. I've checked from the back of the room. If you want to pull out your phones and if you want to scan the code, it'll take you to the website. And over there, you'll find a lot of information on how you can get involved on Feb 12, 2023. But thank you so much for this. And now we're open for questions.